Thank you and welcome at this talk. Okay, I want to start with a small journey back in time through 3 citations. I read the original, my slides offer translations. Citation, so this is the opening slide. Citation 1, when Russian writer Tat'iana Tolstaia started her weblog in December 2007, she warned readers, «Я оставляю за собой право писать с ошибками, нарушать все правила грамматики по собственному капризу и материться». Citation 2. In 1927, literary theorist Viktor Shklovsky wrote about montage and the possibilities of the new medium of cinema. Конечно, надо усовершенствовать аппарат, но работа художника состоит и в художественном использовании технических затруднений. Поэзия основана на несовершенстве человеческой речи. Citation 3 is so well known that I first want to see if someone here happens to know it. So can anybody guess, I'm wondering, from which text these words stem? And I'll read the original in German to give you time to think. Ihr Spiel, ihr Singen hat den unangenehm richtigen, geistlosen Takt der singenden Maschine. Uns ist diese Olympia ganz unheimlich geworden. Es war uns, als tue sie nur so wie ein lebendiges Wesen. Can anybody scream, do you happen to know which text this is? Does anyone know? Okay, no, you don't know. Less famous than I thought, but I do think many of you will know the title and the text of this work. For this citation, I went back further in time. In 1816, German romantic writer and composer E.T.A. Hoffmann famously placed an automaton, a self-operating machine, at the heart of a love story. In Der Sandmann, a student meets a picture-perfect girl and falls for her. And the story ends darkly. The student discovers that he has fallen for a machine masked as human. He loses his mind and dies. So on that happy note, welcome everyone and many thanks to the colleagues here for their invitation to this event and to the citations I return later. In this talk, I decided to ponder our conference's central topics, technology, culture, society, by studying the nexus between technology and imperfection. And that's a topic that I have been studying for quite a while. I promise after a year or two or so, I'll stop studying it. But it has had my interest for a while. And my presentation consists of 3 parts. I first explain why I think that when we talk about technological transition, we need to talk about the perfect and the imperfect, and about dreams of imperfection. And I use that phrase, dreams of imperfection, for visions of imperfection as something good. So dreams of imperfection triggered by technological progress. In part 2 of the talk, I outline which dreams of imperfection we witness today. And in this part, I ask which positive promises do contemporary media users and producers in Russia and elsewhere project onto the non-perfected. In part 3, I ask, how can older stories help us to understand the contemporary preoccupation with imperfection? And in answering that question, we examine 2 historical periods in which cultural producers and consumers face drastic technological transitions. The first is Romanticism, and the second, the early 20th century. And you will see at the end that from this story, 3 rhetorical strategies emerge that resonate particularly vividly in debates about technology and imperfection. Which strategies those are and why they merit our attention, I leave those questions until the end. Okay, 2 methodological remarks before we start. The first, my research is indebted to critical discourse analysis, and I cite linguist Norman Fairclough, systemic transdisciplinary analysis of relations between discourse and other elements of the social process. What this means is that I do not offer one fit-for-all definition of the term imperfection, but what I do is to study how others use or have used this concept. And with that aim in mind, I close-read and juxtaposed relevant texts, including literary prose, interviews, blog posts, manifestos, and PR slogans. So very different types of texts. Two, and this is a very important disclaimer, please pay attention, especially if you are, for instance, a historian, or an area specialist, which I know many of you are. Rather than local, disciplinary and historical specificities, in this research I examine analogies and patterns across social domains, times and spaces. And I agree with these scholars that such a broad comparative approach is simultaneously a burden and a great opportunity for cultural historians, but also, so it's sort of, there is this tension between the two. It's good and it's complex at the same time. To that tension I return at the end of my talk. Okay, so part one. Experts frame our age as mediated, digitized, or even post-digital. And to that age, perfection matters in multiple ways. As these images illustrate, tech producers strive by definition to perfect lives with continually perfected new products. Perfectionism also thrives among technology users, and that development is not unproblematic. This study suggests that, and I'm citing the authors, social media use precious young adults to perfect themselves in comparison to others, which makes them dissatisfied with their bodies and increases social isolation. So this social media urge to perfect has even spawned public concern about such prettily named new diseases as Snapchat dysmorphia. I don't know if some of you happen to know this term, if you've come across it, but patients with this condition want to resemble their filtered selfies so badly that they turn to plastic surgery. And I see some of you laughing. The name is of course funny, but the disease itself is very unfunny. So what I don't do in my research is I shun the cultural pessimistic tone that analyses like these sometimes adopt. You know, they can be very negative about new media in general. That's not something that interests me, but I mention them here because they do illustrate the cult of perfectionism that reigns among tech companies and also the broader politics of imperfection of technological advancement. And I'm citing two sources that talk about those tendencies, which you see here. Okay, so that's part one. Part two, the politics of technology-driven perfection also generates counter-responses. And to explain how these counter-responses work, I start in medias res with Tat'iana Tolstaia's blog. When Tolstaia started her weblog, she was already a renowned writer, and her blog swiftly attracted up to 13,000 regular readers. The blog is no longer active today, but between 2007 and 2016, Tolstaia was an avid and widely read blogger. In her first post, Tolstaia advised her impatient audience to dose their expectations of her blog with this opening credo. Typos, errors, for this author, she suggests, the blog is a confined discursive space where she rejects the strict obligations of print publishing. Now, in this publication, I analyzed how, at first sight, Tolstaia, the blogger, indeed employs a non-polished writing mode. But I also showed that when you take a closer look, you see a very different picture. In practice, the promised errors fail to appear. I studied hundreds of her posts and I did not find a single mistake. I did often see Tolstaia scolding others for language flaws. Here, for instance, and this is actually why I like the picture, because she's very good at making this move at others. Here, for instance, she rebukes subtitlers of an American TV series, and she says, «У вас что, жопа вместо головы? Какое право вы имеете зарабатывать, калеча смысл, калеча как английский, так и русский язык? Козлы, неучи, удавитесь». This fragment nicely illustrates a paradox in the weblog. The same Tolstaia who promises typos publishes impeccably written posts. And the same Tolstaia who promotes mistakes angrily corrects other people's language faults. Now that she does this is in itself not surprising. Tolstaia was trained in classical philology in Leningrad when a hypernormative language culture dominated Soviet academia. So the question is not why does she correct readers, but why would a precisionist linguist promote errors in the first place? Now for the answer to that question, we need to zoom out and reflect on the blog as writing medium. In the 2000s, Tolstaia's take on online writing matched a broader trend among post-Soviet writers to see blogging then a new communication technology whose status was keenly debated in public in mistakist terms. So what they did was they talked about blogs in terms of errors, playfulness, mistakes. In this analysis, I demonstrated that several influential Russian writers and journalists praised blogging services as outlets for playful or imperfect writing. In a representative essay, journalist Marina Mitrionina praised blogs and other online texts for their приоритет искренности над грамотностью. Yeah, and in fact, this Mariana, I think, already mentioned my book. I don't have it on the slides here, and somehow I forgot to bring it for the book exposition. But I talk about that citation also in my book, Sincerity After Communism, which came out in 2017 with Yale University Press. So if you're interested, that's another source to look at more information on this topic. So the interest in imperfect language of Mitronina, Tolstaia, and others can be explained in multiple ways. It fits a trend among professional writers to idealize non-standard speech, which is a very old trend. It resonates as hard today in hip-hop as it once did in Pushkin's work. So I just gave you two out of many sources that ponder this habit here. The choice to cultivate mistakes also matches an interest in a globalizing world to practice language crossing. So the use of language varieties, as this study calls it, associated with social groups the speaker does not normally belong to. Tolstaia's blog motto taps from subcultures with which professional authors are not normally associated. That of online Russian padonki slang, for instance, and I'm sure some of you here will know this online slang as well. In the mid-2000s, padonki exchanged what they called the бездушной правильности, and do look at the Russian spelling here too. I added both because they have a very specific way of spelling words. Бездушной правильности of spell checkers for deliberate misspellings. По мере совершенства компьютерных spellcheckers, so padonki believed, русский язык еще больше потеряет своих непосредственности и обаяния. I always feel like I need to actually pronounce the typos or the deviating spelling, but that's hard to do. Okay, padonki slang, language crossing, non-standard writers, all these practices feed the post-Soviet writers' interest in mistakes. There is another emphatically transnational, transdisciplinary trend without which this insistence would be unthinkable, and that's the trend that has my special interest here. And here we zoom out yet a little more from post-Soviet writing to a much broader menu of cultural practices. And this is the present-day trend to frame imperfection as something positive. I share 6 examples of this trend. 1, in composing this virtual reality opera, Dutch composer Michel van der Aan noticed that its virtual characters initially had what he called uncanny valley, unrealistic feel. And he solved that problem by, I'm citing him, deciding to show the digital imperfections, end of citation, and glitches. 2, in this essay, art theoretician Boris Groys witnesses an eroticism of imperfection in post-Soviet art and in photographs of, sort of clumsy photographs of Soviet citizens, of homeless people in post-Soviet Russia in particular. 3, for Australian photographer Alex Kearns, the disabilities of impaired animals are perfect imperfections which make them unique. 4, in his collection Beautiful Imperfection, Ghanese designer Steve French explores the nexus between mental illness and creative expression. 5, some of you may know this book as well. It's been a bestseller for years now, an American self-help book. This book tells readers, in our mediatized age, we can only lead wholesome lives by accepting our imperfections and shortcomings. And 6, very down-to-earth example, British supermarket Tesco produces perfectly imperfect pears to reduce waste. So these are tips of an iceberg of positive present-day claims about the imperfect, claims that 2 PhD students and I studied together in this research project at Amsterdam University. And what I'm talking about today is part of the book that I'm writing as an outcome of this project. So The dreams of imperfection that we examine stem, as you saw, from various world regions, social domains, genres, and they boast varying language pragmatics. A Tesco ad works differently than, say, a Shklovsky citation. But they share important things too. One, all focus on that which is not perfect. The state, and I cite a dictionary term, a definition of being entirely without fault or defect, satisfying all requirements, corresponding to an ideal standard, or pure, total, lacking in no detail. In all of these examples, this flawless state is exchanged for a logic of norm deviation, incompletion, or decay. A second thing that they share, in each example, the non-perfected is praised as a hallmark for something good. Aesthetic satisfaction, for instance, social inclusion, authenticity, or mental well-being. In some practices, the dichotomy perfect-imperfect flip-flops altogether, as when Kern speaks about perfectly imperfect animals. And the third thing that they share, each example responds to social transitions, ecological or economic crisis, for instance, but also mediatization and technological shifts. Their makers and users embrace the imperfect in an attempt to cope with a reality in flux. Now, critics, and this is an important moment for me, or an important footnote to share, more than a footnote. Critics understandably raise eyebrows at some aspects of imperfection fandom. They say, yes, but aren't imperfection aficionados always haves rather than have-nots? You know, for the images of homeless Russians that Groys calls erotically imperfect, buyers pay thousands of euros. They say, don't we consolidate rather than defy perfect norms if we call, say, a one-armed woman beautifully imperfect? And in idealizing counter-norms, aren't advocates of imperfection downplaying real-life problems? Kearns's cute animal photos bypass the chronic pain that impairments can entail. At the same time, pleas for imperfection are they're not just fun for the privileged. Some play quite helpful roles in diminishing excessive consumerism, for instance, in enhancing social inclusion and other productive social interventions. But today, and we're moving to the last part of my talk, I explore neither the contemporary interests in imperfection as such, nor its pluses and minuses. I want to conclude by briefly turning to its historical lineage. How can older stories help us unpack current pleas for imperfection and pleas against technological perfection in particular? To answer that question, we could look at many historical cases. There's a lot to look at to answer that question. Scholars observe, for instance, an art of imperfection in traditional synagogue building. Synagogue architects design irregularities to remind visitors of the imperfection of creation or the promised land Israel. Other scholars distinguish an aesthetics of imperfection in 17th century Japanese tea ceremonies, where tea masters idolized worn bowls to criticize their patrons' wealth. Now, these tea bowls, the cracked walls, they are two examples from a longer list of historical traditions that positively value the non-perfected. And from that long list, what I did was select two periods that witness a particularly persistent, discipline-transcending interest in imperfection, and that is the Romantic era and the early 20th century. In both periods, pleas for imperfection were born not primarily from economic or religious deliberations, as the tea bowls and synagogue designs are, but in response to technological transitions. So we start with Romanticism. Perfection had been found wanting. It was now the time to turn toward imperfection, toward approximation, as the most desirable modes of dealing with informational processing. With these words, cultural historian Virgil Nemoianu typifies a triumph of imperfection, as he calls it, in European Romanticism between 1815 and 1848. Nemoianu says the Romantic era was an age of globalization, urbanization, social mobility, and it confronted higher educated citizens with an avalanche of informational data. In response, they attempted to digest the psychological, the philosophical implications of these changes in ways that Nemoianu frames as near medicinal attempts as reconciliations with a new, often frightful social state. Among the strategies that contemporaries used to negotiate socio-technological transition, Nemoianu singles out that of embracing imperfections, and for him that means foregrounding doubts and paradoxes rather than fixed truths and certainties. This strategy he recognizes in the romantic popularization of science, a preference for crossing disciplinary or artistic boundaries, and an exchange of broader desires of perfection for coziness and intimacy. And that's a direct citation from Nemoianu. So in this book, Nemoianu neatly documents a move away from rigid perfection in Romanticism. Now, what interests me in his argument is the manifestation of that move in one concrete discursive trend, and that is the trend to berate new technologies for correctness and to frame the imperfect as an antidote for their flawlessness. A second look at Hofmann helps to understand how this trend works. Der Sandmann is a famous tale about technology and threat. The story itself, and it's an interesting story with parallels to contemporary love stories with AI devices, for instance, but I leave that story for what it is. I do want to reflect on the words with which Hofmann typifies the automaton. In this and his other descriptions of Olympia, two lexical clusters intertwine. The first we could call a flawlessness cluster. This cluster revolves around nouns, adjectives, and adverbs that underscore the spotlessness, stiffness, regularity, and correctness of Olympia's looks and acts. And the second could be called a death cluster. That darker cluster underlines the automaton's unpleasantness, coldness, soullessness, and lifelessness. So as this overview illustrates, and as others have claimed before me, in Hofmann's world, the machinic is the exact perfect but dead opposite of an imperfect but soulful humanness. Now, what interests me is not this somewhat rigidly binary dynamics in itself, but the social dreams and fears about technological advancement that it reveals. To unpack these, it helps to compare Hofmann's story with an art theoretical text from the 1850s, when information deluge blended with concerns about industrialization and the failed revolution of 1848. And I'm speaking of this influential treatise on Venetian art and architecture by British art historian John Ruskin. Ruskin combines praise for Gothic aesthetics with critique on machine-driven faultlessness. He applauds Gothic artists for managing, I'm citing him, to craft an unaccusable whole out of fragments full of imperfection. He sees in their work a counterdote to what he calls the perfect polishings that rule industrialized Britain. After all, imperfection, he famously argues, is in some sort essential to all that we know of life. Nothing that lives is rigidly perfect. In all things that live, there are certain irregularities and deficiencies which are not only signs of life, but sources of beauty. To banish imperfection is to destroy expression, to paralyze vitality. Maybe some of you know this, but this is still a very popular citation in weblogs. You often see it circulating online today. Now, Ruskin was wary of romanticizing the non-polished and what would rank as ruin porn today. But here and elsewhere in Stones in Venice, he makes clear where his sympathy lies. In his also quite neatly dichotomous logic, just as that of Hofmann, as mapped here, machine-driven perfection equals a lexical cluster revolving around destruction, failure, death, oppression, and overall wretchedness. And the imperfect stands for all things beautiful, whole, alive, and progressive. One of the things that I'd actually love to talk about with Anastasia is how a digital search through his text, we're doing that right now with one of my students with the Gutenberg archive, can somehow tweak these outcomes, but that's maybe something for later. So this is the first sort of overview that I made of his text. Whereas whether Der Sandmann influenced Stones of Venice, I'm not certain of that. I haven't been able to establish that yet, but Ruskin's and Hofmann's rhetoric of imperfection boast clear parallels. And of course, Hofmann's text was so popular at the time that it's likely that Ruskin knew it. In both, technology equals dead perfection, and imperfection is a source of life and aesthetic joy. We move to a more recent historical period, and the last period that I want to look at, and that's the early 20th century. If, in the Romantic era, a technology-induced logic of imperfection triumphed, that conclusion prompts the question, what happened once this triumph of imperfection materialized? How, more pointedly, did creative professionals think and talk about technology and perfection or imperfection after Romanticism? Now, to answer these questions, it helps to look at this study by music historian Gioia. Gioia criticizes a tradition to frame early and mid-20th century jazz as art that is charming despite or even thanks to its technical imprecision. He theorizes jazz music instead as an aesthetics of imperfection, one that consciously prefers the haphazard and defies aesthetic standards which seek perfection in art. Those are his citations, as you see here. This imperfect art of jazz, he says, returns to art an ethos of individualism and the human element. And in conceptualizing jazz as imperfect art, Gioia helpfully contextualizes its birth age. He explains that the early 20th century was a time of novel music and recording technologies and of growing pleas for seamless music and dehumanizing approaches to composition. Gioia also draws up a useful parallel between jazz and Romanticism. In his words, the insistence in jazz on improvisation, individualism, and anti-institutionalism emblematizes an aesthetic sensibility, this is his citation again, essentially romanticist in character. And Gioia also invokes Ruskin's writings on imperfection and Gothic art when he talks about this sensibility. Now, what Gioia overpasses and what interests me is another sensibility that the jazz era and the Romantic era share. In both periods, technological advancement and pleas against perfection not merely co-occurred, but actively intersected. In the early 20th century, across Europe and the United States, musical and photo, film and print technologies became available to broad audiences. And in response, a transdisciplinary interest in imperfection then resonated across a much broader range of cultural disciplines than Gioia acknowledges. And technological transitions mattered more to this imperfection cult than he implies. And to demonstrate what I mean when I say that, I will share 3 examples. One very famous, sort of over-famous in cultural studies in 1936, but we can't go around him here. 1936, Walter Benjamin famously described the world of mechanical reproduction as a radically new place, one where cultural objects lacked an aura. To Benjamin, the sphere of authenticity resides outside technical reproducibility, and even perfect reproductions miss the presence of original artworks. Benjamin, in short, theorized technology as a domain of standardized perfection and the non-technological as a counter-arena of authenticity and originality. 2. Historian Anna Fishzon has studied late Imperial Russian discourses of sonic fidelity triggered by the rise of a mechanized record industry. Listeners worried that recorded music lacked pathos, and producers then tried to recreate performers' authentic sounds on record with hyper-polished recordings. Philosopher Theodor Adorno promoted a different strategy. In 1927, he argued, as rephrased by Fishzon, that it was the residue of incidental noises and other imperfections that paradoxically make the recording sound human. Benjamin sought authenticity outside the technical, but Adorno found it in flaws inside new technologies. 3. Victor Shklovsky famously framed poetry as a technique of roughening language. As we saw, he viewed this roughening of language as an important artistic strategy in times of technological shifts. Artists should welcome technological innovation and embrace its challenges. It is from this play with technological challenge that a true imperfection-based poetry emerges. That is, in short, Shklovsky's take on art and technology. I added one 4th example that I don't want to talk about, but I just wanted to show it to you. We can talk about it in the discussion if you want, in part because I wanted to repair the gender balance in this talk, to have some more women in. It's a very male overview of voices otherwise. Okay, to summarize, in the early 20th century, technological advancement did not simply run parallel to an interest in the imperfect, but critics, artists connected the two in much more fundamental ways, as you saw in these examples. Okay, I want to conclude. And I want to conclude with the question with which I started. How can older stories help us understand contemporary pleas for the non-perfected? In this talk, I compared first two canonical romantic texts. Hoffmann merely diagnoses technology as dangerously perfectionist. Ruskin offers imperfection as alternative to dead machine-driven perfection. The early 20th century features less pessimistic voices. Adorno projects humanness onto acoustic blemishes. Benjamin opposes authenticity to perfect reproductions. And you've seen the Shklovsky example 2 times now, I won't repeat it. Today, some historical strategies recur. The Padonki Manifesto, signed tellingly by Mary Shelley, revives romantic tropes when it equals computer correctness to soullessness and death. Mitrena is closer to Shklovsky. She says social media stimulate unpolished but sincere communication. Tolstaia celebrates mistakes in theory, and van der A, to revisit an example from this list of 6 samples, instrumentalizes imperfections to strengthen his opera. Together, these recent and other voices highlight the close relationship, and I cite William Boddy, between technological change and cultural form. Boddy and other media historians, I add some relevant studies here, demonstrate that technological shifts inevitably actuate collective dreams, fantasies, and fears. They teach us that when cultural producers and consumers face new communication technologies, they rethink ontological values, especially those values which, in their eyes, technological acceleration puts at stake. Humanness, authenticity, for instance. My findings demonstrate that perfection and imperfection play a central role in this process. Technological transitions trigger dreams about perfecting life and art, phobias for the downsides of these dreams, and debates about expression, realness, authenticity, and vitality. So when you juxtapose the voices, I'm going to ask you for 1 more minute and then we conclude. When we juxtapose those voices, 3 recurring rhetorical strategies surface. 1, perfection pessimism. Perfection pessimists see new technologies as dangerously fault-free, and they call for moving away from technology-induced dead perfection. 2, love for mistakes in the machine. Advocates of this strategy, Adorno for instance, welcome technological advancement but see mistakes in machines or errors by its users as safeguards of humanness, vitality or authenticity. And 3, imperfection activism. Imperfection activists do not just welcome machinic bugs as given, they actively make and toy with mistakes. They hack new technologies or otherwise defy perfection. Of course, just as all taxonomies, this one should be handled with care. Some people whom I discussed fit the model nicely. For others, it's much harder to make this sort of neat fit. But I think it helps us in this preliminary taxonomy, can help us in unraveling the stories that we tell ourselves about technological acceleration. And it can also contribute to this very important task, I think, of boosting resilience against technology anxieties. You've seen that technological pessimists have long feared technology-induced perfection and then responded with invented traditions of authentic human imperfection. But in truth, of course, both new technologies and their human sources always brim with flaws and glitches. So I hope that this historical genealogy helped in accepting that sobering insight. I want to conclude with the final note on broadness. In this keynote, I drew broad comparative lines. I'm aware that that approach is not fault-free, but I see this research as food for new specialized research on technology and its public reception. And I think it would only be wonderful if more specialized studies would require adjustments of this general picture that I painted. So that's an invitation to you, actually. Thank you very much.